Hello, welcome to this podcast. My name is Richard Hayton and I'm at the University of Hull attending the Political Studies Association conference on the theme of the Conservative Party and coalition government. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined for this podcast by Sarah Childs, who is a Professor of Politics and Gender at the University of Bristol. And Sarah has published widely on issues to do with women in politics. So Sarah, many thanks for joining us today for this podcast. Firstly, how does the politics of gender play out in the Conservative Party at the moment?
Well, it plays out in the same way that it does in many parties in terms of thinking about the kind of people who are members of political parties, the kind of people, what sex are the elected representatives, but it also plays out in terms of the kind of policies that different parties put in front of the public. So in terms of the Conservative Party, what you found recently, up to 2010 at least, was it needed to play what I've called the politics of catch-up. The Labour Party was ahead in terms of the number of women MPs. It was returning since 1997, but also in terms of the policies the Conservative Party had had in previous manifestos at 2005, 2001. It didn't really do very well in terms of addressing women's concerns. So by 2010, it needed to catch up and become much more competitive with the Labour Party at that election.
As leader of the opposition, David Cameron was obviously keen to try and increase the Conservatives' appeal to women voters. But why is it that there are still so few female Conservative MPs?
I mean, the problem is institutional. If you look at the House of Commons, it's only 22% female, so it's very, very far from parity. It ranks 53rd following the French elections last week in terms of the global league table. Conservative Party is particularly had difficulties with getting women in, and I'll explain that in a moment. But I think the first thing to recognise that even after the changes in 2010, the Labour Party has more women MPs than all of the other political parties added together. So that David Cameron inherited a very big problem in terms of the lack of Conservative women MPs. And I think in some ways that had been hidden for so long by the memory of Margaret Thatcher. Now, when we talk about the reasons for women's underrepresentation in politics, we often talk about supply and demand, how many women are seeking selection, but also how much is their party demand for women. And one of the things I think we can say about the Conservative Party is that it needed to both increase its supply, but most particularly, and this is true for all political parties, there are enough women in terms of the number of seats that come up at any general election. So the problem is really making sure they're selected for the seats the party already holds or the party's winnable seats. I think we can see from statistics over the last few elections that the Conservative Party, and in fact still in 2010, was putting too many of its women candidates in the seats it had no chance of winning. So Cameron is inheriting this problem, and it is worth stressing that he was very adamant that he was going to address this problem. It was 2 minutes into his leadership acceptance speech where he said, I'm going to address the scandalous underrepresentation of women. So he undertook a whole series of reforms, trying to change the selectorate, those people who select candidates, but also to encourage through his support for the new Ginger group, Women to Win, which was a new associated group to the Conservative Party that put a great deal of effort and time into mentoring and ensuring that women were performing well in interview selections. But the key thing is really about making sure the party selects in its winnable seats. And of course he also used the priority list, the A list as it came known, to try and ensure that the selectorate saw many more women than it previously had seen. But really the issue remained that he has rejected and continues to reject using a policy like all women shortlist, which is what obviously delivered Labour many more women MPs back in 97, but also in 2005 and also in 2010.
The current agenda of kind of the politics of austerity has been flagged up by some people as potentially having a really disproportionately negative impact on women. So how is that going to affect the Conservative Party's ability to appeal to women voters?
It's quite clear, again, post David Cameron's leadership, that in the run-up to the 2010 election, the Conservative Party was really trying to win back those women's votes that it had lost to New Labour, and that it put particular effort in trying to feminise the party. It was one part of that strategy to decontaminate the party. So there was a women's policy review process, there was a sort of policy document produced, and a number of those ideas did make it into the manifesto. So actually in 2010 the Conservative Party was much more competitive on women's issues around domestic violence, around flexible work, around maternity and paternity leave. So the party, if you like, was really quite competitive, particularly relative to Labour, given that that party had placed so much emphasis on those kind of issues under the various governments. What's happened since then is quite clearly the case that feminist civil society groups like the Fawcett Society, Yvette Cooper, so the Labour opposition, have made a number of pronouncements and undertaken a number of studies that show that austerity cuts disproportionately impact women. So the party, if you like, is faced with, if not a feminist critique, at least a critique from the perspective of women who are saying, if you're cutting spending, if you're cutting jobs in the public sector, all of this is going to disproportionately impact women. The question for the Conservative Party is that in some sense acceptable collateral? It's inevitable that it's going to disproportionately impact women, or whether there's something a little bit more, sinister is too strong a word, but a failure to recognise that a whole series of policies do impact women, and that perhaps therefore some of those policies perhaps should not be introduced. So it looks as though, looking at opinion polls, that the Conservative Party has begun to lose the votes of those women it had almost won, or had won back to some extent in 2010. So it looks like there is a gender gap, pro-Labour gender gap, for women voters at the moment. So that suggests that the Conservative Party has to reorientate itself back to winning these women's votes. Now that's quite difficult because it still doesn't have very many women MPs, its presence in the cabinet is quite low, its policy of austerity is going to only get worse in terms of the impact of women's benefits and women's employment in the state sector, given we know that so much of the cuts are still going on. David Cameron has appointed a gender expert, so we need to see to what extent that actually plays out in terms of perhaps a repositioning of the party on some of those issues. So I think there's a hell of a lot that the party still needs to do, but I think it's also fair to say that it did make quite significant progress between 2005 and 2010, but it's how it then embeds many of those reforms as we go through this Parliament.
Sarah, thanks for joining us today. It's been really interesting talking to you about women in Conservative politics.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.